Okay, now to take a turn, but to share more about Elektra and how to bring this opera to life for your communities, please welcome the light of my life, educator, human phenom, Stephanie Hendrix. Will you please reveal yourself? Ah, Stephanie, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'll see you on the other side.
Fantastic. Hi, friends. Welcome. My name is Stephanie Hendrix. I'm coming to you from the unceded ancestral territory of the Penobscot Nation, known as Bangor, Maine. And I am happy to talk to you today about some of the curriculum that I planned for Elektra. Um, a couple of full disclosures before we get started. This is curriculum that I would use in my classroom context, um, but it may not be appropriate for everyone's classroom context. So please use your best judgment with your students. You know them best. It might be important for some folks to understand also that we have had students 5 days in person since September. So while I also have hybrid and remote students in this strange pandemic time, I've also had students in front of me in my classroom every day. And I think there is a slightly different dynamic there with regard to building relationships and curating psychologically safe spaces in the classroom. Um, and so again, just kind of understanding that that is my context, I think is going to be helpful as we talk our way through some of these lessons. And as you look at the resources, there are a number of different resources that I've also curated to help enhance students' experience of the opera, including some really great YouTube videos and some charts and some learning resources that will really help them, I think, dig deeply into the content that we're talking about today. Um, and my approach, so in my classes, I always take a critical theory approach when I'm teaching my students. I do this using picture books. And I start out by reading Ed Young's Seven Blind Mice, which is a parable about seven blind mice who come across a mysterious thing in their space. And each of the blind mice sees one aspect of the thing. Um, and then all together, they realize ultimately that um, the thing is an elephant. And that's sort of the analogy that I use for these different perspectives of critical theory, in that as we adopt or as we apply each theoretical lens to whatever it is that we're studying, we're seeing a part of the elephant, but we always have to remember that there's a whole elephant there. And I think taking a theoretical approach really helps students see things as a body of ideas and methods that can help them be critical consumers of every text that they encounter in the world. And in my experience, it helps too for students to recognize text as both windows and mirrors. So Rudine Sims Bishop in 1990 sort of coined those terms to talk about texts that are windows, allow a reader to sort of look through a window into another world and into another person's experience and to see how they live. And it's sort of a voyeuristic kind of perspective. As opposed to a text that works as a mirror that allows the reader to see themselves, to see their experiences, and to see their humanity and identities, their various intersectional identities reflected back toward them. And I think the lenses of critical theory that are all about sort of exploring intersectionality and really thinking critically help students recognize text as both windows and mirrors. And so when we think about the humanities lessons that I have curated for Elektra, the first one, Blood Will Have Blood, Macbeth is a common text I have to teach every year. And that quote was one that sort of revolved around in my head as I was thinking about the ways in which the characters justify revenge in Elektra. The second activity is called We're All Mad Here. And that's about diagnosing a character's mental state and really applying the lens of psychological criticism and psychoanalytic theory to the opera. And then Family Matters is all about looking at relationship dynamics in Elektra through a lens of trauma and resilience. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what each of these activities look like and how they work. So for lesson one, I think thinking about revenge and the cycle of revenge and this idea of personal vengeance and honor is really important. I'm reminded of a quote from Morticia Addams of the Addams Family, and she says, "Normal is an illusion. What is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly." And I think that quote always helps me think about perspective, right? That what might be normal and honorable in one context would potentially be the opposite in another context. And I think it's really interesting how both Elektra and her mother have these similar needs for vengeance and for seeking out justice, but the question of what the consequences for those actions are, I think it has bigger implications. And so this activity really gets students to explore the nature of revenge. It asks them to create a set of rules to guide when and if revenge is ever justified, and it encourages them to connect the characters' motivations to their own life. And so we start with a reading of Sir Francis Bacon and his short essay on revenge. And he says, "Revenge is a kind of wild justice." This is a really nice short piece from the 1600s that I think helps students see some different things in the text and really connect to this idea of the universality of a human need for revenge and vengeance across time and place, and to really think about how some of that works. And so they start by considering the psychology of revenge and exploring the rewards and consequences for people who reap revenge. There's a really lovely video called The Psychology of Revenge that I've linked up here that actually talks about neuroscience and talks about experiments that were done, sort of hooking people's brains up to MRI scans to sort of talk about the way that their brains respond when they get revenge. And what's really interesting here is that they find that there are some short-term benefits, but there are longer term consequences. And I think it's interesting to connect to some of the more recent research that's being done on this as well. Then students are asked to lean in really closely and to read and listen to Elektra's aria to explore how she justifies her need for revenge. And we saw a clip of that earlier. And then students are asked to compare Elektra's song to other modern revenge songs. And there are a number of revenge songs from Taylor Swift on through to CeeLo Green and various other artists. And so again, really thinking about these universalities across time and place and what are the things that unite these characters and really thinking about motivation. This is an opportune time, I think, to really get students to think about when have they ever wanted revenge for something. And to think about how that has worked in their own contexts and how how things play out. And that leads us into the third component of the activity, which is really all about karmic retribution, right? And this big essential question of whether revenge actually heals or harms, right? So when we talk about revenge, I think a lot of times, and particularly Elektra and Clytemnestra, link revenge with justice. And so this activity really asks students to kind of pick that apart and to tease out some of those bigger issues, and to think about whether revenge is ever a viable solution or if it just contributes to this continued cycle of violence. That activity is also the springboard that I used to connect Elektra to a more contemporary text, which is Jason Reynolds' novel in verse, Long Way Down. And that text is a really lovely own voices text written by Jason Reynolds, who's our young adult literature ambassador. And that text is really lovely because it's about a brother trying to take revenge for the killing of his brother, but you understand that there's this cycle of vengeance at work in his community and the sets of rules that govern the revenge. And those sets of rules are a really nice way to sort of jump back in to these ancient Greek notions of revenge and honor and how things work, and then to connect that to Bacon. You could also, of course, bring in Shakespeare. I think Hamlet and Macbeth definitely have some connections here as well. So I think there are lots of opportunities for digging into that psychology of revenge and really having some conversations about what is the difference between revenge and reparations, right? Does revenge heal or harm? And what are we really interested in when we seek out vengeance or revenge? In terms of lesson two is really anchored in psychological and psychoanalytic criticism. And this is all about diagnosing a character's mental state. So there's some really heavy duty character analysis going on here and a big focus on understanding a character's motivation. So students are going to explore the psychological lens. If folks need resources for how to do that, I did include a bunch of videos to link up with this activity, but there's also a really great book, actually a couple of books, one by Tim Gillespie and one by Deb Appelman, that are both about using literary theory in the classroom. And both of them have some really great ideas for if you haven't ever done something with critical theory in your classroom. They have some really good ideas and some accessible ways for jumping into those sorts of conversations. And so I highlighted this quote by Sigmund Freud. He says, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They're buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." And I think that's something to think about, particularly as we think about sort of what our students have been going through and the extent to which they've had an opportunity for processing and catharsis with regard to the grief that's associated with the pandemic and everything that it has brought with it and everything that it has exposed. And so, you know, I sort of see, I see the study of text as sort of social work, right? In that kind of the way we talk about text and the way we talk about characters in my classroom, I hope helps give my students the tools for being better humans and for getting some deeper understanding of how they should be in the world. So the lesson components for this one really start out with some psychological inquiry. And this is very much based in the Freudian theories of id, ego, and superego, and sort of the way that personality is defined by Freud. The way I like to explain id, ego, and superego to my students is I show a cartoon clip from a Donald Duck cartoon, and it's all about Donald Duck, and he's got his devil on the shoulder represents his id, wherein, the id wants us to be happy all the time and wants us to have all of our needs and desires met no matter what. The angel on your shoulder is kind of like the super ego that is telling you to follow the rules and to kind of live up to those social and cultural expectations. And then your ego is that character in the center that is trying to balance between those two forces. Like, how can I have as much fun and meet as many desires as I want while not getting in too much trouble in my context, right? And so for this activity, students are really sort of putting the character of Elektra on the couch, so to speak, and paying attention to her motivations and to some of the things that come out in the libretto, and really thinking about the extent to which she seems more driven by her id or her superego. And again, I think that gets at that, like, is this personal vengeance? Is it about honor and these sociocultural expectations? What's kind of happening there for her? And thinking about what the consequences are if she can't find those balances. Again, sort of sticking with Freud's theory as well, and really talking about the importance of dreams. This activity focuses not on Elektra, but on Clytemnestra and her nightmares, and the way that she asks her daughter for help curing her nightmares, and really thinking about how our dreams and our nightmares are symbolic of our state of mind, and what the fact that she can't sleep might reveal about her psyche. And so we really think about dreams and unconscious fears, and there's an activity here that I think asks students to think in a pretty symbolic way about some of the things that are happening in the opera. And then last but not least, in terms of the psychology of relationships for this particular set of activities, that's really all about that psychological lens, students are invited to consider that Oedipal complex, and then Carl Jung talks about the Elektra complex. And I'll be honest, in my classroom, and I had this conversation on Friday, interestingly enough, with my students, my juniors. So these are 11th graders. We talked about Lacan and Lacan's interpretation of the Oedipal complex as much more symbolic, whereas Freud, because Freud's a structuralist, so he tends to kind of see things in a little more literal sort of way, and Lacan is leaning more toward post-structuralism, so he sees things in a more symbolic way. You could do this in the earlier activity too. If you want to talk about Lacan, instead of id, ego, superego, he talks about things like the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And so, if you have students that are ready for those conversations, there are ways to have them in meaningful and important ways in the classroom with students. And so that activity is connected to an article on Common Lit, and that asks students to really think about the emotions and motivations of the characters in the opera and how things work there. There's also a really fantastic TED Ed video that I linked up here too, that is history versus Sigmund Freud. And what I think is fascinating for students to recognize and realize about this is that different disciplines use Freud in different ways. And so while in the realm of psychology, for the most part, there has been a divergence from some of Freud's thinking and theories, in literature, people are still using those theories as a way of interpreting text and ideas. And that video of history versus Sigmund Freud does a really nice job in about 5 or 6 minutes of kind of getting at the problem of Freud. for students in a way that I think makes sense for them. And then last but not least, lesson 3 is all about family matters and the relationship dynamics in Elektra, and really thinking about the extent to which people experience loss and trauma over the course of their lives, and really thinking about how, for some people, these events disrupt their ability to function and others are able to cope and recover. I often use an article with my students here that uses a plant-based analogy to think about this, where they talk about how some people and some folks' psyches are more like orchids. They're very fragile and they need a lot of care, and they need a lot of TLC and a lot of specific nutrients and temperatures and sort of all of that stuff. And other people are dandelions, right? Like you mow them over, they're just going to pop back up again. And when I do this, I connect with Tupac Shakur's The Rose That Grew from Concrete, and we talk about some of that as well. And so in this activity, students chart the risk factors that impact Elektra's life. They explore the protective factors that might be able to help her cope in healthier ways. And they actually make a recommendation for what could or should Elektra have done differently, or how could the situation have been resolved in a healthier way. I love this quote from Maya Angelou. She says, "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated." And so as students work their way through this set of lessons, they chart all of Elektra's relationships with her family members, and they diagnose the extent to which those relationships are healthy or toxic, and which of those relationships heal or hurt her. And then we dig into the libretto and we look at really specific sections from the libretto and add even more details to that family dynamics chart. Then students do a little bit of research, and I've kind of broken some of this information down in charts that are available in the lesson that really talk about risk factors, things that cause trauma in individuals' lives, and then those protective factors, right? Those factors that help us find ways to cope and find ways to heal when traumatic things happen to us. And so this activity asks them again to sort of go back in and look at what are the risk factors that Elektra is dealing with in her experience? What are the protective factors that are there for her in her family and in her community? And what advice might students offer to Elektra to help her cope and heal in more healthy and productive ways? And again, I think using a character to help dig into some of these questions and to explore these questions through a text, through a piece of literature, through somebody else, I think those explorations can work to help students and readers and viewers of the opera find catharsis of their own. So as they're thinking about the things that happen in Elektra's life, maybe her story works as a mirror for them in some ways and reflects some of those emotions or some of those traumas back to them, and really exploring those protective factors that might be able to help, and understanding how that might work for a character might also have benefits for the students who are doing that exploration. I want to end here just in case there are questions, or if there's anything that I can do, or if there's anything that folks want to know more about. You're welcome to reach out to me via email. My personal Gmail is probably the best way to get me. That's stephanie.a.hendrix@gmail.com. And I know we're not there for Lulu yet, but I wrote some activities for that opera as well. So I'm happy if folks have questions about those activities to once you dig into the Google Classroom and what becomes available, you can also reach out to me about those, because there's some pretty heavy content there about the gender lens and exploring intersections of gender and power, issues of human trafficking, and various other fun and excitement. So yeah, that's what I have for you all.
Does anyone have any questions for Stephanie that you would like to ask? Anyone?
Karen
Oh,
has
I
a
see Karen. I
question.
see a hand from Karen Saxon. Karen, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Hi, good
So good to see you.
afternoon. It's good to see you too. So, the first of all, thank you for your detailed and always stellar presentation. The thing that got me really right at the beginning was your mirrors and windows framework. Can you say
Not
more?
mine. Yeah, I would love to tell you more. It is absolutely not my framework. Like hashtag cite Black women. Rudine Sims Bishop is the goddess who came up with that framework. And she talks about texts as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And so again, yeah, I didn't talk about the sliding glass doors part, but I'll mention that here because you asked. So if you read a text that's about another time period or another culture or another experience that's different from your own, oftentimes that text becomes a window into that place or that experience or that context. And so you sort of peer through the window and you watch what happens with those characters and see how they interact. And then like it's almost like ethnography, where you can sort of take notes and you can observe and learn from what happens. But texts can also work as mirrors. And the mirror piece works in a lot of different ways. And it's why it becomes so important to teach texts so that every student sort of sees themselves represented in ways so that they see their life experiences validated and reflected back to them as a mirror image. But I think when you're talking about text, when you're talking about opera, and you're talking about these sort of emotions like vengeance and revenge that are universal things, I think some of that emotional connection can also be a mirror, can also be a mirror for our students as well. And then the sliding glass door piece. The sliding glass door piece comes in because, we teach texts and opera, and we study all of this stuff so that we can be better humans, so that we can learn more about how to be in the world by becoming proximate with other people's stories. And so when you have an experience with a text that is both a window and a mirror, that text becomes a sliding glass door because it allows you to sort of walk through and be in the world in a way that validates people's whole complex identities. And it's really pretty spectacular. Later on, I'll throw the link to that Sims Bishop article in the chat. It's a pretty short article. It's like 2 pages, but it is well worth the dive. So I recommend it. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. And Stephanie, I just want to draw your attention. Great question, Karen. Stephanie, just one last question from Tim Brendler in the chat. Tim says, you provided so many great activities to invite students into Elektra's mindset and experience. I particularly love the flower analogy. What will you likely lead with to immediately get students to buy into Elektra?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. Do you know what? Quite honestly, I don't have a lot of trouble getting students to buy into text. And sort of the way that I've set up my classroom this year, I've been very deliberate about decolonizing my curriculum. And so you'll notice that none of these activities, connected back to the Greek play necessarily, or to any of those Greek plays, right? But instead, I connected to a Jason Reynolds novel. Um, but what I start out with, the first text that we study is Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. And then we read some articles about how the canon gets constructed. And we talk about how the canon is a dangerous single story. And then from there, I am sort of layering on all of these theoretical approaches. And so we read a number of different texts and we talk about the social class lens and look at intersections of social class and power. And we watched the Park Avenue documentary and the whole psychological experiment with the Monopoly game, and we talk about gender and power, which is where kind of all those Lulu lessons sort of come in, and then here, we're really talking about how do we figure out how to be in the world, and the texts that I use in this particular lesson are Ava DuVernay's 13th and In Cold Blood, because we use, and Macbeth, and Long Way Down, because all of those texts, like, we start by talking about like revenge and vengeance and all of that stuff, and then that leads us into like 13th and In Cold Blood to these conversations about justice and the way that those things are linked. And I find that students are just fascinated to have these conversations, and they welcome the conversations because from what they tell me, they're not happening in other contexts. And so I get a lot of gratitude from my students for giving them spaces to dig deeply into some of these issues.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you, Tim, for that question. That beautiful slide deck that Stephanie presented will be, I believe, available in the Google Classroom after Monday. Stephanie, we can't thank you enough. Your brain
Thank
is
you.
magnificent.